We are the 2016 Festival of Books in Tucson, Arizona. Today we are here to interview Margaret Peterson Haddix, the author of The Always War. My name is Malik Henry, and I will be interviewing the author along with
Ariana Conyas, Emily Beausejour, Stephanie Longoria, Sonia Lopez,
Corey DeBellis.
Alright, good afternoon, Miss Haddix.
Good afternoon.
Alright, so my first question for you is, does writing a book sometimes get complicated? And if it is, do you feel sometimes that what you write doesn't make sense?
Yes. I really am not sure that I should be admitting that, but sometimes as I'm going through the books, I'm like, how did I get my characters into this position? How do I possibly get them out of this? The wonderful thing about writing a book, as opposed to in your real life getting yourself into a complicated situation that you're not sure you can get out of, is with the book you can go back and change what happened before. And revision is wonderful for that if I'm just in such a complicated situation, I can go back and put something in earlier that will help the character out of that scene, or go back and have her mother say something to her on her way out the door to school that then will enable her to get out of the situation. And writing a book is a lot easier than living real life.
Do any of your ideas come from music or TV?
Music or TV is a part. I'm trying to think. I don't think I've ever been directly influenced to write something by something on TV. I'm not a big TV watcher, so maybe if I watch more TV of it, more would inspire me. There have been times that with music, certain moods that I've gotten from music have affected me and kind of have helped me write. Or if there's something that I'm listening, a particular artist that I'm listening to a lot while I'm writing, that I'm sure bleeds into it. But I can't think of a time that something like a line from a song is then the inspiration for an entire book. That's never happened to me, although I have met other authors that has happened to.
So me and my stepsister Jasmine want to build an orphanage when we grow up. And so I was wondering if you have helped the community by donating or just helping them out. And if you did, would you write a book about it?
I have helped out a lot of people in circumstances that I feel very lucky that I'm not in myself. I have a couple situations that kind of relate to your question. I have a book that I wrote very early on in my career. I used to work as a newspaper reporter, and one of the stories that I did as a newspaper reporter was about kids who had been abused or neglected and then had to be taken away from their parents and raised by foster parents, or in some cases adopted. And I interviewed a lot of kids who technically the state of Indiana, which is where I was working, became that child's parent because their own parents couldn't or wouldn't take care of them. And after talking to all of those kids, I ended up writing a book called Don't You Dare Read This, Mrs. Dunphy. You can't get this in the audio, but one of the people just was like, oh, I know that book. Just by her face, I could tell that. That was why I wrote that book, was because of my experience talking to those kids and wanting to do something to help them. So that was a situation where, because of talking to those kids, I wrote that book. I also, with my daughter, went and helped out at an AIDS orphanage in Honduras one summer. So I have done a lot of that kind of thing.
How does your family influence your writing?
When my kids were younger, and now they are both in their early 20s, so they're not the same age as the characters that I'm writing about, but when they were younger, I would ask them, okay, if this happened to you, or if this happened to one of your friends, how would the people around you react in the classroom? So they were very useful for that kind of thing.
Why did you become a writer?
I became a writer because I really loved books. That was kind of just the simple reason for it.
What was the first book you wrote, and was it cool?
The very first book that I wrote was a book called Running Out of Time, and it is about a girl who's growing up in what she thinks is just an ordinary village in the early 1800s, and she finds out when a bunch of kids in the village become sick and her mother kind of secretly confides to her. She finds out that it is really a historic village in the modern world, and she has to go out and get help for the kids who are going to die if they don't get modern medicine. So that was an idea that I got from something that I did as a newspaper reporter as well. And it was hard because I didn't know if I could do that or not. That was hard. And then it's also hard to get a first book published. So I got to collect a lot of rejection letters before my very first book was published.
If you had a chance to get sponsored by any corporation, who would it be?
Wow. That is a question I have never been asked before. I guess in a sense you could say that I am sponsored by the publisher of my books, which is Simon & Schuster. So I guess I should say them, but in terms of, like if Nike came to me and said, would you wear our shoes? And I kind of really wonder about that type of a situation. I really want to make sure that I was being sponsored by someone that I trusted, I guess.
Time travel guarantee.
Or a time travel company. Yeah, that'd be a great company to be sponsored by.
Have you ever incorporated any of your characters with your traits or qualities?
Yes, her question was about incorporating my traits and qualities into my characters. I have done a lot of that. And I kind of feel like I can't write about a character until I feel like I have something in common with that character. So even the villains in my books, the ones that I really do not want to be like, I kind of give them some of my characteristics, like maybe I'm a little bit selfish and they're 99% selfish, but because I'm a little bit selfish, I can understand what they're doing. So I would say all of my characters have some connection to what I'm like.
What is your writing process?
My writing process varies from book to book quite a bit, and it's not consistent at all. But some of the books that I've thought of, I get the idea and then I kind of just think about it. It's in the back of my mind lurking for years before I actually sit down and say, okay, this is the next book I'm going to write. And during that time, it's like I'm kind of taking the idea out and playing with it a little bit and imagining the characters and imagining scenes, and then I put it away and do something else. And when I get to the point that I say, okay, this is the book that I'm going to write next, then I usually sit down and kind of map out what's going to happen in the book. Sometimes I kind of figure out who the main characters are going to be and kind of say what they're going to be like and kind of make notes to myself. And probably anybody else looking at those notes would say, this doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But because I've kind of mapped that out and I kind of have confidence that it's going to work right, I start on it, and sometimes a lot comes to me as I'm writing that even if I think the book's going to go in this direction, it goes in a totally opposite direction because I think of something that I think is going to be even better than what I had been thinking about originally.
What theme were you trying to display in the Always Were and the Missing series?
I'm sorry, say that again?
What theme were you trying to display in the Always Were and the Missing series?
Well, there are a couple different things in both books, both The Always Were and the Missing series. There were a couple different things that I was kind of playing around with for myself. With The Always Were, obviously I was thinking about the concept of war and how we deal with it as a society and how it affects society as a whole if everything about that society is geared toward fighting that war, how that changes us all. So that was one of the things that I was thinking about kind of as a theme, and technology is also a big theme in that, and kind of looking toward the future and how it's going to play out. There are things like that I was playing around with. And with the Missing series, one of my majors in college was history, and I think history is fascinating. All these things that happened to people in the past that we don't have to deal with, thank goodness, in many cases, like not having toilet paper, simple things that we take for granted. So it was largely out of a fascination with history and some of the mysteries that are in history that to this day we don't know the answers to, that I got to kind of imagine what might be the answers to some of those mysteries.
does it take for you to write a book?
It usually takes me 2 to 3 months to do the first draft of a book, and when I got the earlier question about my writing process, I should have mentioned that I don't just write the first draft and then I'm done and, that's what's published, that there's always a revision process as well, and that can sometimes take another 2 to 3 months, so 4 to 6 months per book is usually what I figured.
Which book was the most fun to write and why?
Oh, I have been asked that question before about which of my books is the most fun to write. And when I stop and I think about it, I'm like, well, this one was really fun and this one was really fun. I end up listing every single book I ever wrote. Because I have a really fun job. I'm very lucky to get to do something that is so enjoyable and it is what I love. So all of them were the most fun.
How does finishing writing a book feel like?
Oh, finishing writing a book, the first emotion is kind of just relief. It's like, okay, I made it through. I've never run a marathon, but I think it's kind of how you would feel when you get to across the finish line after running a marathon, that it's that, oh, I made it. Then my second emotion is often feeling really sad because I really enjoyed hanging out with those characters. I really enjoyed playing around with that situation. And I'm actually I kind of go through not a serious depression, but kind of a moment of being really depressed that I don't get to do that anymore. And then usually, a lot of times what happens is that I say, okay, I'm going to take a break and I'm going to deal with all these things that I've ignored doing because I was writing this book. And I'm gonna take a week off or take 2 weeks off and do other things. And I almost always end up starting a new book right away because I just like having a book that I'm writing always.
Out of all the characters in your books, is there a certain one that stands out the most to you?
I don't know that there's a single character that stands out to me the most. I have a very special affection for Jessie, the main character in my first book, because I felt like I didn't know what I was doing, and she's kind of a take charge type of character, and it was almost like she grabbed me by the hand and said, we can do this, it's okay, you'll be fine. And she gave me confidence, which I know sounds really weird because I made her up, but it makes me sound a little crazy, but that's how I felt.
Are you currently thinking about a new series that you're going to write?
I am actually, thank you for asking that. I actually have started 2 new series. I have a new book that came out in January of 2016 called Under Their Skin, and there is a second book coming out related to that is called In Over Their Heads. It'll be coming out in 2017. So that's like the shortest series ever, just to have 2 books in it. And then I have another series that's starting that is called Children of Exile, and the first book is coming out in September, and then probably every September the next 2 years after that will be the second and the third book. And I've already written the second book in both of those cases.
What topics are you planning on writing about in the future?
After I finish writing the book, I'm writing a book now about 2 girls who get to go to Spain for the summer. So that's kind of what I'm focusing on at the moment. And then after that, I'm kind of thinking about a lot of different ideas, and I'm not sure what will end up being the next thing I do.
How do you come up with the plot of your books?
Usually there is something that sparks the original idea for my book, just some situation that I think is very interesting. And sometimes it's just a situation, and then I think what kind of a character would be in that situation or would be interesting to be in that situation, and how would somebody get out of that situation or deal with that situation, and that's kind of how the plot's developed. I ask myself questions.
Where did you get the idea for the book The Always War?
There were a couple things that led me to think about The Always War, and one of them was when one of the first times I was in a car where somebody had GPS, which I know is very common and we take it for granted now, but when it first came out, it seemed really weird that you could just have this voice coming out of the dashboard of your car, and if you did what the voice told you to do, you would get where you needed to be. Except sometimes you don't get where you needed to be. I mean, sometimes people have driven off cliffs, and into lakes because they say that's what the GPS told them to do. And the first time I was in a car where somebody had GPS, the woman who had it, she was driving me around. I was on book tour in Los Angeles, and she was telling me that she just did what the GPS told her to do. And she said, it's kind of weird. It always makes me go around this one section in Los Angeles. And I don't know why, but I always do what it tells me. And my question was, what is in that section of Los Angeles the GPS doesn't want you to see? And she's like, I don't know. And you should never say something like that to an author, because instantly I was imagining all these things and not listening to anything else she told me. And one of the things that I imagined was the situation in the Always War. And so that's what I wanted to write about. Let's see, who are we? Okay.
Who are most of your books dedicated to, and why do you dedicate it to them?
That is a good question. Many of my early books were dedicated to either my kids or my husband, and then I started doing my nieces and nephews, and I've had 37 books come out over the past almost 21 years. And so at a certain point, when you're dedicating books to the same people over and over again, they're like, yeah, thanks a lot. So I've tried to vary it a little bit, and sometimes now I'll dedicate it to a friend or somebody that has some connection to the main point of the book itself.
Did you ever see yourself becoming an author when you were really young?
I decided when I was in about 3rd grade that I would really love to be an author, but I had not met anybody who was an author. I grew up in a very rural, I lived on a farm, I grew up in a very rural area, very isolated. I'd never met an author. And so it wasn't really something that I saw as possible. I thought of it as like, this is a daydream. Like, I might daydream about being a ballerina, or my brother might daydream about being in the NFL, but, the reality is we're not going to make it, especially since I didn't take ballet lessons. There was no way I was going to be a ballerina. And I kind of thought that's how it was to be a writer. But all through school, I always took writing classes. In college, that was one of the things that I studied. And at a certain point, I'm like, this is possible. Maybe I could do what I think isn't even possible.
So in English, they teach us to follow the climax and the rising action, the falling action. Do you ever drift away from that?
Yes. Those are good guidelines for things, and it is true that once you have the climax of a story, if you then just go on and on and on and on, and all the tension is gone, people would get kind of bored with the story. So there are some things that you always have to follow, but it's also possible to play around with some of those rules. And sometimes I'm not really even thinking about, rising action, falling action, how that all works. But then sometimes I go back and I'm like, wait, what's wrong with this? Oh, I'm going on too long after all the tension is gone. So yeah, I need to fix that. I should probably keep it in mind more often.
What was the book that you spent the most time brainstorming?
Oh, the most time brainstorming about? It would probably be one that I thought about for many years before I actually wrote it. It might actually be the book that just came out, Under Their Skin, because I got the first part of that idea about 10 years ago. And so 11 years ago, something like that. So over the course of those 10 or 11 years, I was thinking about it quite a bit.
How do you come up with the personalities of your characters?
Sometimes I get the personalities of the characters just because they kind of show up in my head and they say, this is my story. Sometimes as I'm thinking about a story and what kind of person would be most interesting in that particular situation, sometimes that's why the characters are the way they are. Sometimes if it's a situation where I figured out who the main character is, and then I know that there's another character who's also important, I need that character to be kind of different from the main character, so that you as the reader don't get them confused. So there are a variety of ways that I come up with the characteristics. And sometimes it's like I know somebody in real life who has kind of an interesting quirk that I think I'm going to give that to a character in one of my books.
What Which book was the most difficult to write and why?
There's kind of a three-way tie for which of my books was most difficult. One of them was I did the 10th book in the 39 Clues series, and that is a series done by a variety of you know that book too. That was a series that was done by a variety of different authors, and I did the book that finished off this clue hunt that had been going on for 9 books, and I felt this enormous responsibility to the other authors that I was working with that I would do a good job on that. That it was a situation where if I failed, I would let everybody down. So that was something that made it harder. And we were also on very tight deadlines, and the 7th, 7th, 8th, and 9th books were not done when I needed to write the 10th book. So that made it very hard as well.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think we've reached the end of our interview time now.
Okay, thank
These
you.
are all really great questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. I hope you guys are having fun.
You were my favorite author.
Oh, thank you.
What school do you go? What school?
Floyd Mills Junior High.
Taryn.
Yes.
Yes.
Cool. So you've been reading right now. Okay.
Could you autograph your favorite drawing in this book?
No, you
Sketch
all.
me?
My favorite drawing.